They tell you that combat is the hard part. They tell you this because most of the people doing the telling have not been in it. Not really. Not the kind where the math changes on you in the middle of a sentence, and you have to finish the sentence anyway. The instructors at Reach Integration said it to us every rotation. The kinetic phase is manageable. The kinetic phase has rules. What breaks people, they said, is the waiting. They were right about the waiting, but they were wrong about what makes it hard. The waiting is not hard because it is boring. It is not hard because your body is coiled for something that doesn't come. It is not hard because of the sleep deprivation or the ration quality, or the fact that you are 3 relay jumps from the nearest human facility, and the communication lag means any message you send won't get a reply for 11 hours minimum. All of that is manageable. All of that is just logistics. The waiting is hard because you have to watch something being built around you, and you cannot say a word. I arrived at Orth Station in the 7th month of the contested Reach bilateral agreement. Staff Sergeant, 3rd Reach Contingent, attached nominally to Joint Command as a liaison-rated combat specialist. The title meant I was too senior for the enlisted billets and too politically inconvenient for the officer spaces, so they put me in the middle category that the Varunei Compact called the transitional advisory role, and that the rest of the human contingent called the gap between a handshake and a closed fist. Orth Station itself was not much. It sat on the outer rim of what the Varunei had originally claimed as Sen Proxima, a designation that the bilateral agreement had reclassified at considerable cost in negotiating capital as the contested Reach. The world beneath it was Class 16, tidal locked, with a terminator band of survivable temperature running about 400 kilometers wide. The rest was either scorched rock on the day side or methane-cold desert on the night side. The station was anchored to a high-atmosphere platform above the terminator, which meant that at any given hour of the day, you could look out of the observation blisters and see a sky that was half fire and half dark, with a seam of amber light running along the horizon where they met. I found it useful for thinking. I spent a lot of time in the observation blisters. The station ran approximately 340 personnel when I arrived, 212 Varunei and 128 humans. That ratio had been contested during the agreement drafting, and the Varunei had won the argument about proportional staffing. What this meant in practice was that the Varunei occupied the command spaces, the communications center, and the upper residential decks, while the human contingent was assigned to maintenance, perimeter monitoring, and the lower operational billets, not overtly hostile, just geometry. Suvith Dal was already on station when I arrived. I didn't know his name yet. I knew his type. He was standing at the arrival processing terminal when I came through decontamination, a Varunei political officer, which meant he was not a soldier. The Varunei political tier has its own uniform coding, a deeper indigo trim on the collar and sleeve margins, distinguishing them from the military slate gray that the soldiers wear. He was tall, the way Varunei tend to be, with the characteristic subdermal luminescence running faint patterns under the slate-purple skin, something between iridescence and a heartbeat made visible. The eyes were amber gold and forward set, which with their species indicates high social rank. The orbital structure is denser in the dominant castes, built for intimidation across a conference table. He was not looking at me when I came through. He was looking at his data tablet. That was the tell I needed. A soldier watches the door when someone comes through. A soldier watches the door even when he is pretending not to watch it. It's involuntary, the same way you blink. Suvith Dal was studying his tablet with the particular concentration of someone who has decided, ahead of time, that he will not look at the door. That kind of deliberate not looking takes effort. Effort means preparation. Preparation means he had already decided what he thought of me before I arrived. I filed that away. I collected my billet assignment. I thanked the processing clerk in my best Varunei formal register, which produced a small, Startled pause because most humans on the joint stations do not bother with formal register, and I went to find my quarters. They were on the third lower deck, 2 levels below the maintenance corridors. There was a viewport, which was the only thing about them that was not purely functional. The viewport faced night side. I lay on the bunk and looked at the dark half of the world and thought about everything I had just seen. The human contingent's senior officer at Orith was Major Davin Price, a quiet man from the outer reach settlements who had the particular quality that you sometimes find in people who grew up knowing the margin was thin. He was careful with everything. Careful with words, careful with resources, careful with trust. He had been on station for 14 months, and he had the look that comes with it. Not beaten, not broken, but compressed, the way a spring is compressed. Holding energy he had not yet spent. He briefed me on the station dynamics within the first 12 hours. He did it carefully, in the maintenance corridor adjacent to the third lower deck, where the ambient noise from the atmospheric processors meant that the standard Varunei monitoring suite would have difficulty isolating a conversation below a certain decibel threshold. He had not told me that was why we were meeting there. He didn't need to. I'd already figured it out from the route he'd taken to reach me. The command structure is formally joint, he said, but decisions above operations level 3 go to Varunei command with a notional human concurrence requirement that in practice takes 11 days to process if they want it to, and 40 minutes if they don't. Who holds the level 3 designation? I asked. Dal. That was the first time I heard the name. I noted it. Political officer? Political officer with a compact security secondary credential, which means he's not just here to manage the optics of the bilateral agreement. He has investigative authority within the station's administrative jurisdiction. Price looked at me steadily. He's been here 4 months. In that time, 2 human specialists have been transferred out. One was a systems engineer. One was a communications tech. Both transfers were framed as performance-based reassignments. Neither of them had ever had a negative evaluation before arriving here. I thought about that. What were the grounds? In the first case, a reported safety incident involving mishandled atmospheric processing equipment. In the second, a logged communications irregularity that the tech in question maintained she didn't generate. Price's voice was even. I filed objections through the joint channel. I received acknowledgments. The transfers went through. I looked at him. He looked at me. How long have you been waiting for someone rated for this? I asked. He thought about it for a second. About whether to be honest, I think. Since the second transfer, I nodded. All right, I need a week of unobserved time and access to the station geometry manifests. I can get you the geometry manifests through maintenance requisition. Unobserved time is harder. I'll manage the unobserved time, I said. I just need the manifests. He had them to me by the following morning. Orith Station had been in operation for 11 years by the time I arrived. In 11 years, a station accumulates its own kind of institutional sediment. Systems that were flagged for update and not updated. Processes that were designed for a staffing level that no longer applies. Maintenance items that were logged and assigned and somehow never closed out. The sediment is not malicious. It is just the result of attention being finite and the list of things requiring attention being longer than the list of things that get done. On any given station, the sediment tells you things. It tells you which systems have priority, because those are the ones that get maintained. It tells you which spaces are genuinely monitored, because those are the ones where the monitoring equipment is current. It tells you where the institutional focus goes, and by inverse, where it does not go. On a joint station, the sediment also tells you something about the power relationship between the parties. A system flagged by a human specialist and not acted upon is a data point about who has authority over maintenance decisions. The 2C junction sensor node had been flagged by a human systems technician, the same technician who had subsequently been transferred out in the first of the 2 pre-arrival transfers Price had told me about. I noted that very carefully. The flag had been filed. The flag had been acknowledged. The node had not been replaced. And the technician who filed it had, within 6 weeks of failing it, been removed from the station on grounds of a safety incident involving atmospheric processing equipment. A completely separate system, in a completely separate part of the station, about which the technician had made no complaint and raised no concerns. Suvith Dal had been on station for 4 months when I arrived. The technician had been transferred 4 months before I arrived. I spent 2 hours on the first night doing the arithmetic. By the time I stopped, I had a reasonable working model of Suvith Dal's operational objectives, his methods, his timeline, and his failure modes. It was not a complete model. I was missing the specific mechanism he intended to use, and I was missing the precise trigger event. But I had enough to start preparing the ground. The first thing I prepared was a reading list. I submitted a request through the Joint Station Library System, fully visible, fully logged, for the complete text of the bilateral agreement and all 14 of its appendices. The request was processed and granted in approximately 4 hours. Access to the bilateral agreement is public within the Joint Station Administrative Framework. The document is 342 pages. I read all of it. I took 11 days. I read it in sections, in the observation blister, in the maintenance corridors during scheduled breaks, in my bunk during the last hour before sleep. I read the appendices in the same order they were numbered, which meant I read Appendix C, the personnel protocol, on the 7th day. When I reached Provision 7, I read it twice. Then I read the 2 provisions that follow it, and the provision that precedes it, to understand the context and the relationships. Then I read Provision 7 a 3rd time. Then I set the document down and looked at the night side of the Class 16 world, and thought about what I had just found, and what it meant for the shape of what was possible. I want to explain what I mean by reading the room, because people often mistake it for something it's not. They think it means being perceptive in some elevated sense, some kind of intuitive genius that certain people have and others don't. That's not what it is. Reading the room is a discipline. It is a set of habits so deeply installed that they run below the level of conscious thought, and you are receiving and processing information continuously, the way your lungs receive and process air. You do not decide to breathe. You do not decide to watch. What you decide is what to do with what you see. On Vale Prime, Class 17, where I spent 18 months before the Reach deployment, the thing that will kill you is the thing you failed to track yesterday. Not today, yesterday. The environment on a Class 17 world has a memory longer than yours. It has been killing things since before your species had the concept of being killed. What you learn, if you survive long enough to learn anything, is that the only useful question is not, what is threatening me right now? The useful question is, what was true 4 hours ago that is going to matter in the next 30 seconds? Suvith Dal thought he was watching me. He was. He had 2 operatives on station. I identified them in the first week. A Varunei logistics coordinator named Ren Vath, who spent slightly more time near the human contingent's secure storage than her route assignments required, and a systems analyst named Corteth, who had the habit of looking at a screen while facing a direction that let him track foot traffic in his peripheral field. Neither of them were obvious about it. They were professionals. But professionals have patterns too, and patterns once seen are as readable as text. I did not change my behavior. This is the part that takes discipline. More discipline, honestly, than any physical endurance test I have passed. And I have passed several that produced casualties. I kept my schedule. I ran maintenance checks when I was supposed to run them. I ate in the common mess at the same hours. I attended the joint briefings and I asked the questions a liaison specialist is supposed to ask. And I took notes that a liaison specialist would take, and I said nothing that could not survive being recorded, analyzed, and presented at an inquiry. And while I did all of that, I watched. The geometry of Orith Station is, at its operational core, a ring structure with 4 radial spokes connecting to a central hub. The ring houses the residential decks and the standard operational spaces. The spokes carry utilities, communications conduit, and emergency access routes. The hub is the command and communications center. Standard joint station design, optimized for modularity and ease of expansion. The Varunei had built it. The humans had been integrated into it after the bilateral agreement was signed. What this meant was that the Varunei knew the station in the way you know a space you built. They knew where the blind spots in the monitoring suite were because they had designed the monitoring suite. They knew which maintenance corridors were acoustically isolated. They knew the lag tolerances on the emergency bulkhead systems because they had specified those tolerances. What they did not fully account for was that I was from a Class 16 world by assignment and had spent my career on environments that actively wanted to kill me and learning the geometry of a space, the real geometry. The geometry beneath the schematic is not something you do consciously. It is something you do because every time you enter a new room, you are already asking, where are the exits? Not because you plan to use them, because knowing where they are is the difference between a room and a trap. Within the first 2 weeks, I knew 3 things that Suvith Dahl did not know that I knew. First, the emergency access route through Spoke 2, below the communications conduit, was not included in the active monitoring sweep. It was on the maintenance manifest as an active route, but the sensor node in junction 2C had been flagged for replacement 4 months ago and had not been replaced. The flag was in the system. No one had acted on it. In the interim, the corridor was dark to the monitoring suite, a corridor that ran from the lower operational decks to a secondary junction 12 meters from the command hub. Second, the Varunei security rotation for the upper residential decks ran on a pattern that left a 7-minute gap at the handoff point between the first and third watch. 7 minutes is not long. 7 minutes is very long, depending on what you need to do with it. Third, Suvith Dahl was working to a timeline. I could see it in the compression of his activity. The frequency of his meetings with Ren Vath increased in the 3rd week, and the meetings shifted from the logistics corridor, where they had previously occurred, to the command hub's secondary briefing room, which had a hardened communications connection. He was not escalating his surveillance of me. He was finalizing something. Moving from observation to action, he had been building a case. He was close to done. I needed to know what the case was. I needed to know the shape of what he intended, not to stop it before it started, because stopping it before it started would only push it back, and I could not stay in observation mode indefinitely. I needed to know the shape so I could let it run and be at the riot place when it collapsed. I got the shape from Ren Vath, and she never knew she told me. The common mess runs 3 service periods per standard day. The middle period is the lightest. It falls in the overlap between the operational watches, when the highest activity personnel are either in transit or in the command spaces. During the middle service period, the mess runs at roughly 40% capacity, and the acoustic character of the room shifts. There's a quality to a half-empty room that a full room doesn't have, where individual conversations carry further than the speaker intends. Ren Vath was not a careful eater. She ate efficiently, and she ate at the same table near the northeast corner, which was the warmest corner because of the heat exchange conduit running in the wall behind it. And Varunei run slightly cold by human standards and tend to seek warmth when they're not focused on anything else. She's always sat with her back to that wall, which is a soldier's instinct. She had military background somewhere, even if she was nominally logistics now. On the 16th day, she had her tablet with her. She was eating and reading, which she did occasionally. What she did not do on this particular day, because she had not done it before, and I had not yet seen her do it, and therefore had not calibrated for. It was plug one earpiece in to take a communication while eating, tilting her head to the left the way people do when they're listening harder than they're talking. I was 4 tables away. The mess was at 42% capacity. She had plugged the earpiece into her left side, which put the tablet slightly angle open toward the room while she stabilized it with her right hand. I did not move closer. I did not make any change to my posture or my eye line or what I was eating. I am telling you this because it matters. Everything I did in the next 6 minutes I did without moving, without appearing to attend to anything other than my ration pack and the maintenance schedule I was reviewing on my own tablet, which was very boring, and gave me an excellent reason to sit still and look at a screen. The Varunei formal diplomatic register is a structured language with a separate register for secure communication that collapses certain grammatical indicators. When you are listening to a secure register conversation from across a room without the full audio, you are working from partial signal. You catch the grammatical skeletons, the high-frequency consonant clusters, the stress patterns that indicate noun versus verb. I had been studying Varunei formal and secure register for 11 months before arriving at Orith. Not because I was told to, because I knew where I was going and I wanted to be ready. I caught the stress pattern indicating a formal date anchor, a specific countdown, construction used in Varunei operational planning. I caught a cluster that in the secure register collapses to something approximately meaning isolation event, a procedural term from the Varunei security canon that refers to separating a target from its support network before initiating formal proceedings. And I caught, repeated 3 times in the way Varunei repeat a critical term when confirming it to a superior, a construction that in the formal register means approximately the primary pathway is sealed. Suvith Dal had a plan. The plan involved isolating me, and as of the 16th day, the primary pathway was sealed. I finished my ration pack. I reviewed the last 3 items on the maintenance schedule. I left the mess at the same time I always left it. I went to the observation blister above Spoke 3, and I looked at the fire half of the sky, and I thought about exits. There were 3 ways off Orith Station in the event of a commanded evacuation. The primary route was the main docking collar on the hub's upper face, where the Joint Command vessels were berthed. The secondary route was the emergency pod array on the ring's outer edge, 16 individual pods rated for atmospheric entry and surface survival. The tertiary route was the maintenance airlock on Spoke 4's outer terminus, which required a suit, a tether, and the willingness to traverse the exterior of the station to reach any docked vessel. Suvith Dal's plan, as I reconstructed it over the following days, operated on the assumption that my relevant exit was the main docking collar, that if things went wrong for me on the station, the natural move was toward the hub and the berth-bills vessels. This was a reasonable assumption. It was what any person relying on standard procedure would do. The plan also operated on the assumption that Spoke 2's 2C junction was monitored, that the maintenance corridor there was a controlled space. This was understandable. It was on the manifest as a monitored space, and the plan operated on the assumption, the deepest assumption, the one that was doing the most load-bearing work, that I did not know what I knew, that I was a liaison specialist sitting in a gap role on a joint station, following my schedule, reading my maintenance reports, unaware that I was being studied and positioned, and prepared for something formal and terminal to my assignment, and possibly to more than my assignment. Suvith Dal was a paid man. He had spent 4 months building the conditions. He had moved carefully, incrementally, using the legitimate mechanisms of his political security authority to reshape the station's administrative environment around a single objective, removing the human contingent's most operationally capable member in a way that looked procedural, looked documented, looked like the natural consequence of a performance and conduct review, rather than the result of a political decision made 4 months ago in a compact security briefing room. He was patient and he was thorough, and by every measurement available to him, he had built something solid. I spent the last 5 days of the 3rd week preparing, not visibly. Everything visible stayed exactly the same. I ran my maintenance checks. I attended briefings. I ate in the common mess. I had a technical exchange meeting with one of the Varunei engineering staff about the atmospherically processor calibration variance that had been a minor Genuine, ongoing maintenance issue since before I arrived. I was genuinely helpful in that meeting, and the engineer left it with 3 actionable recommendations she had not had before. I did this because it was useful, and because it was true to the work, and because the work does not stop being real just because something else is also happening. In the maintenance corridors and the observation blisters and the 6 quiet minutes of each watch handoff gap, when the monitoring suite's pattern made the risk low, I prepared. I want to describe the 3 weeks because people have asked me since. People who have reviewed the board records or read Price's supplemental report. What it felt like to spend that length of time doing nothing. What they mean when they ask that is, how did you not act? How did you see it being built and not move to stop it? The answer is that I was acting continuously every day of those 3 weeks. The action was just invisible to anyone who was not already looking for it. There is a kind of work that looks like stillness. On a Class 17 world, Vale Prime, where I spent the 18 months prior to the Reach deployment, there is a predator in the deep Terminator zones called a Deathcrawler. It is roughly 2 meters at the shoulder when fully extended, has 12 independently articulated limbs, and has the thermal signature of the rock it rests on, because its metabolic rate drops to something approaching geological when it is waiting. Survey teams lost members to Veth crawlers for 6 months before someone worked out that the rocks in a certain zone were not rocks, because a rock does not very slowly breathe. Once you know the breathing, you can see them, but you have to be looking for the right thing. Most of the survey teams were looking for movement. I was not looking for movement on Orth Station. I was looking for breathing, the slow, patient, preparatory respiration of a process that has decided what it's going to do and is simply getting its timing right. I verified the sensor dark status of the 2C junction corridor by walking it twice on different days with a passive detection tool I had built from components available in the station's maintenance stores. A passive detection tool of this kind is not sophisticated. It tells you whether active sensing is present in the electromagnetic range the Varunei monitoring suite operates in. The corridor was dark both times. The sensor node had not been replaced. I identified and confirmed the communications conduit access point that ran above the 2C corridor, 12 meters from the command hub junction. The access panel was standard maintenance format. The conduit inside carried the station's primary external communication relay, the hardened line that bypassed the standard in-station network and connected directly to the Varunei Compact's relay infrastructure. It also, incidentally, carried the secondary signal line for the station's internal security coordination channel, the encrypted channel through which Suvith Dahl's operational network communicated. I was not going to touch the conduit. I was not going to interfere with the communications channel. I am noting its location because it matters for understanding the geometry of what was about to happen, and because one of the things you learn on a Class 16 world is that the geometry is always the story, not the people. The people are just what fills the space. The space is what determines what is possible. I confirmed the emergency pod array's operational status through a routine inspection I was authorized to perform as part of the contingent safety compliance requirements. All 16 pods were live. Bay 7 was adjacent to the access corridor that connected to Spoke 2's lower ring junction, meaning that from the 2C corridor through the junction along 40 meters of ring corridor, a person could reach Bay 7 in approximately 3 minutes of unhurried movement. I worked out my timing. I ran it 4 times in my head against the watch rotation patterns until the numbers were consistent. 7-minute gap at the handoff, 3 minutes to Bay 7, 4 minutes to do what I needed to do in the command hub's communication junction before anyone with authority to stop me would know I was there. I did not need 4 minutes, I needed 2. On the 22nd day of my assignment to Orth Station, I went to sleep at my regular hour and I slept well. I sleep well before operations. This is not bravado. It is simply that by the time I go to sleep the night before, I have finished the work that can be finished. I have run the contingencies. I have accepted the ones I can't control, and I have built redundancies into the ones I can. There is nothing more useful to do in the dark hours than to sleep, and my body knows this, because I have trained it to know this across enough operational cycles that it has accepted the rule as binding. People on Veil Prime who could not sleep before an operation did not last long on Veil Prime. It is not a world that gives you a second attempt to rest. You learn to take the stillness when it is available, because you do not know with certainty when the next stillness will come. I lay in my bunk in the third lower deck, the viewport facing the night side of the Class 16 world, and I looked at the dark horizon for approximately 6 minutes. Then I closed my eyes. I had two options if what I had arranged did not hold. Option 1 was Provision 8 of the Bilateral Personnel Protocol, a lesser-known provision, allowing a human contingent member to request direct arbitration by the Reach Integration Command Authority on grounds of procedural impropriety, which would have stopped the external relay entirely and kicked the matter up 2 levels to a flag officer who was outside compact jurisdiction. Option 1 required documentation I had prepared and was holding in my billet. I had not needed to use it, but it had existed, ready, since day 18. Option 2 was the emergency pod in Bay 7. I had not needed that either, but I had known exactly how long it would take me to reach it, and what to do when I got there, and where the nearest human-flagged installation was in relation to Orith Station's orbital position. I had worked out the math on day 8, in the observation blister, watching the Terminator line. The options were there. I did not expect to use them. But options that exist before you need them are not the same as options that exist when you're already moving. By the time you're already moving, they're not options anymore. They're just what you're doing. And what you're doing at that point is whatever you could get to in time, which may or may not be what you actually wanted. I had wanted to stay on Orith Station. I had wanted to see the matter resolved procedurally, through legitimate mechanism, in a way that left a record. Not because I care about records for their own sake, because a record is the thing that follows Suvith Dahl to his next assignment. A record is the thing that makes the next one harder. A record is the geometry of the next engagement, already being shaped before the next engagement exists. I had wanted that. I had gotten it. I closed my eyes and slept. Suvith Dahl moved on day 23. I knew he would move on day 23 or 24 because the timeline, compression I had observed in the preceding week indicated he was within his final preparatory phase. And because a piece of information I had been waiting for arrived on day 22, Major Price received formal notification of a Joint Command review of the human contingent's operational scope, scheduled for day 28. A review of that kind, under the bilateral agreement, required that any personnel under active administrative inquiry be removed from the station environment pending resolution. Administrative inquiry proceedings under the Varunei Compact Security Protocol could be initiated by a political officer with compact security credentials at any time on the basis of documented conduct concerns. And once initiated, they were self-executing within the Joint Command structure. The notation went into the personnel file. The Joint Review Board received automatic notification, and the individual was placed in restricted status pending the board's determination. The process was clean, legitimate, and nearly impossible to contest from inside it. The review was on day 28. Dahl needed the inquiry initiated before the review, so that I would be in restricted status when the board convened. He needed to move by day 25 at the latest, and moving earlier gives any procedural action more time to solidify before it can be challenged. Day 23 was when he would move. He moved at 0340 station time, in the dead middle of the second watch, when the contingent sleep cycle was at its lowest activity point, and the common spaces were at minimum occupancy. I was not in my bunk. I had left my bunk at 031 Sensed during the gap before the watch handoff. I had walked to the maintenance corridor adjacent to the third lower deck, a route I had taken before for legitimate maintenance purposes, and therefore one that would not flag as anomalous in the movement records. From the maintenance corridor, I had moved to the Spoke 2 access point, through the 2C junction and its unmonitored corridor, along the upper maintenance crawlway that ran parallel to the communications conduit, and into a position 12 meters from the command hub junction where I could see, through an inspection aperture in the conduit housing, the secondary briefing room's access panel. At 0340, I watched Suvith Dal enter the secondary briefing room with Renvath and a third Varunei I had identified 2 weeks earlier as a compact security documentation specialist, the administrative equivalent of someone who notarizes the paperwork after the decision is already made. They were in the room for 11 minutes. I timed them. At 0351, they exited. Dal went toward the hub command spaces. Renvath went toward the upper residential decks. The documentation specialist went toward the communications center. An administrative inquiry had just been initiated. My name was in it. Within the joint command system, the notation was now processing. I had 2 minutes before the documentation specialist reached the communications center to send the external relay message that would lock the inquiry into the joint command record. I moved. I want to be precise about what I did and what I did not do, because precision is the difference between a story about a person who did something justified and a story about a person who did something illegal. And I am not interested in stories where I'm the latter. I did not interfere with administrative inquiry. I did not alter any records. I did not touch the communications conduit or the relay infrastructure or anything that belonged to the Varunei compact systems. What I did was enter the communications center through its maintenance access panel, which is a route that exists in the station geometry for legitimate emergency maintenance purposes. 12 seconds before the documentation specialist arrived through the main door, and I had with me a piece of paper. Paper is a human thing. The Varunei use data crystal formatted documents and hardened tablet submissions for official processes. They do not use paper as a formal medium. I had written on paper in Varunei formal register a standing request that I had submitted to Price 2 days earlier for his counter signature. A request under Provision 7 of the Bilateral Agreements Personnel Protocol, which allows a human contingent member to request a formal joint inquiry review by a senior human officer before administrative proceedings advance to external reporting. Provision 7 has a 72-hour processing window from the moment a personnel action is initiated. It applies to any administrative action affecting operational status. It was written into the bilateral agreement at some cost during negotiation because someone, not me, I was not in the room, had been careful enough to know that the Varunei would eventually use administrative process as a weapon and had wanted a tripwire in the system. When I handed the paper to the communications center duty officer, a Varunei petty officer who had been on station for 3 years and who had never in his career seen a human bring a written formal request to the communications center at 0353 in the morning, the inquiries. External relay was, by the terms of Provision 7, under a 72-hour hold. The documentation specialist arrived 22 seconds later. I was already in the room. The paper was already logged. The hold was already in the system. I looked at the documentation specialist. He looked at me. He looked at the paper. He looked at the duty officer. The duty officer, who had logged the document because it was a legitimate document presented by a person authorized to present it, showed him the receipt. I said, in Varunei formal register, I look forward to the review process. Then I walked out through the main door. What I am about to tell you about the next 18 hours, I am telling you because it is the part that matters, not for what happened, but for what it tells you about the nature of patience and the geometry of a trap that has been built correctly. Suvith Dal spent 2 hours trying to identify the mechanism by which his inquiry had been held. This is understandable. He had spent 4 months building it, and finding it stopped by a piece of paper in the middle of the night was not something his model of the situation had included. He pulled the duty officer's logs, which showed a clean and legitimate transaction. He reviewed the personnel protocol provisions, which confirmed that Provision 7 was valid and applied. He had his legal specialist review the bilateral agreement language, which took 3 hours, and the specialist confirmed that the hold was procedurally correct and would require a joint review board action to override. The same joint review board that was already scheduled for day 28. Suvith Dal was not finished. He was not a man who was finished easily. I had known that from the first morning. He pivoted. If the inquiry was on hold, he would use the intervening 5 days to add to the conduct record, find something that supplemented the existing documentation, gave the joint board a stronger basis for advancing the inquiry over the Provision 7 challenge. He directed Ren Vath to increase observation activity on the human contingent's common spaces. He pulled my movement records from the station's monitoring suite for the preceding 23 days, looking for anomalies, looking for anything that could be characterized as conduct outside assignment parameters. He found one anomaly. The movement records showed a gap in my location data between 0317 and 0409 on the morning of day 23, a period during which I was in the unmonitored 2C corridor and the communications center's maintenance access route. From the station's surveillance system's perspective, I had been on duty in the maintenance corridor near my bunk, and then I had been in the communications center's main corridor. The gap in between was blank, not explained. 72 minutes of missing location data. Suvith Dal had that gap by midday on day 23. He brought it to his security specialist, who flagged it as a potential indicator of unauthorized movement and system evasion, which is a conduct violation under the Joint Station Operating Protocols. This was a legitimate concern. The gap was real. I had used the unmonitored corridor, and it had done exactly what I expected it to do, left a gap. He submitted the movement anomaly as a supplemental incident report at 14:30 on day 23, linking it to the existing inquiry. I had expected this too. I had expected it because if I were him and I had found the gap, I would have done exactly the same thing. At 1500 on day 23, Major Price submitted a maintenance variance log entry, timestamped, signed, and countersigned by the station's joint facilities manager, a Varunei engineer named Soth Vren, who had countersigned the entry because it was an accurate entry, and she was, professionally speaking, careful about accuracy, noting that Staff Sergeant Morrow had been assigned to conduct a survey, inspection of the 2C junction corridor's sensor node, given its outstanding flagged status, and had reported the inspection at 0412 on day 23. The maintenance records, when the security specialist pulled them, showed the flag on the 2C junction sensor node. They showed the outstanding status. They showed the logged request I submitted through the maintenance system on day 21 for authorization to conduct the survey. Inspection. They showed Price's authorization, logged on day 22. They showed the completed inspection report I had submitted at 0415 on day 23, noting the node's continued non-operational status and recommending replacement within the current maintenance cycle. The 72-minute gap in my location data was in the maintenance record, a documented authorized inspection of an unmonitored corridor. There was nothing anomalous about an authorized maintenance inspection, generating a gap in the monitoring record. That was what the gap in the monitoring record was supposed to indicate. It was literally the correct behavior of the system, working as designed. I had submitted the maintenance survey request on day 21 because I had known, from the moment I identified the gap in the monitoring coverage in the first week, that eventually someone would notice the gap in my location record and need an explanation for it. The explanation needed to be ready before it was needed. The inspection report was real. I had conducted the inspection. The recommendation about the sensor node was genuine. The node needed replacing. Everything in the record was true. Suvith Dal's supplemental incident report linked to a movement anomaly that was, on further review, a documented, authorized maintenance inspection of an ongoing maintenance deficiency, carried out by a person with documented authorization, logged and completed and reported through proper channels. His security specialist's follow-up memo, submitted at 1844 on day 23, found no conduct violation. The gap in the location record was explained. The behavior was within parameters. I ate dinner at the same time I always ate dinner. I had the protein ration with the grain supplement and something that was supposed to be a vegetable analog, which it resembled the way a technical drawing resembles the thing it depicts. The mess was at 61% capacity. Renvath was not at her usual table. Corteth was not in the mess at all. I had not seen either of them since midday. I considered what that meant. Renvath's absence was new. She had maintained her routine throughout the preceding 22 days, even as the operation around me had been in preparation. Operatives who break routine do so because something has disrupted the routine's rationale, because the thing they were tracking is no longer where they expected it to be, and they have been redirected to find out where it went. She had been redirected. That told me Dahl was already working the anomaly, had already identified that the documentation specialist's relay submission had been held, and was currently trying to understand how. Let him try to understand how. The how was in the record. The record was clean. I ate slowly. I drank 2 cups of the hot beverage that the Varunei called nesh water, which is made from a compressed leaf extract and tastes approximately like warm minerals with an aftertaste of something vaguely floral, and which I had been drinking for 3 weeks and had developed a genuine tolerance for, possibly even a preference for, at the end of a long day. I thought about Suvith Dal sitting in the secondary briefing room with a conduct report that had just been assessed as not constituting a conduct violation and an administrative inquiry that was on a 72-hour hold and 5 days until a joint review board convened. I thought about what he would do next. I thought about what I had that he did not know I had. And then I stopped thinking about it because there was nothing left to prepare. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. Either it would hold or it would not, and if it would not, there were still 2 more options, and I had already worked them out. But I did not think I would need them. I finished the nesh water. It was almost good. I returned my tray and went to the observation blister above Spoke 3, and I watched the fire edge of the Terminator line turning amber, dark for about 20 minutes. The Class 16 world below was not hospitable to anything I would recognize as life. But it was clear, from the orbital perspective, about exactly what it was. You knew where you stood with it. There was something to be said for that. I had grown up on a world that was, by the classification system the Varunei Compact uses, a Class 12 Deathworld, Earth. I am not going to explain to you what that means in biological terms. If you are reading this, you already know. What I will tell you is that growing up on a Class 12 world does not mean you spend your childhood in daily combat with the environment. It means you grow up knowing, below the level of conscious articulation, that the environment is not on your side, and that your species' continued existence is a function of continuous, low-grade, entirely unremarkable vigilance extended over every waking hour of every day. Humans domesticated the predators that should have killed them. They built cities in zones that should have drowned them, or frozen them, or burned them. They looked at everything the planet threw at them and they said, "This is workable." Given time and attention and the willingness to be careful, they were not fearless. They were afraid, and they did the work anyway. Generation after generation, until the doing of the work was as natural as breathing, and the fear was just information. Useful information. The kind that tells you to look harder at the thing that doesn't quite fit. Suvith Dal had spent 4 months on what he thought was a straightforward operation. He had selected a target who, by the administrative profile, was a mid-grade human specialist in a liaison role, not a combat posting, not a high-profile assignment, the kind of person who fills a bilateral agreement requirement and does not make trouble. He had looked at the profile and seen manageable. He had looked at the quiet routines and the ordinary schedule and the unremarkable mess hall meals, and he had seen, not a threat. He had been looking for movement. A Veth crawler does not move when it is waiting. Movement is the thing it saves. The Terminator line went on being amber. The dayside went on being fire. I went back to my bunk and I finished the maintenance schedule I had not gotten to in the afternoon. And I filed the 2 items that were due for response by 0800 the following morning. And I went to sleep. 6 days left until the board convened. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. The Joint Review Board convened on day 28, as scheduled. The board consisted of 3 members: a senior Varunei command officer, a Varunei administrative adjudicator from the Compact's Bilateral Affairs Directorate, and a human flag officer who had traveled from the Reach Integration Command facility. A journey of 9 hours by fast courier, which meant Price had requested her presence on day 24, 2 days after the inquiry hold was filed, anticipating the board's convening and ensuring a human flag presence before Dahl could shape the agenda. That had been Price's move, not mine. He had made it without telling me, which is how I knew he was better at this than he looked. The board reviewed the inquiry documentation. They reviewed the Provision 7 hold. They reviewed the supplemental incident report and the follow-up assessment finding no violation. They reviewed 23 days of my duty log, maintenance records, briefing attendance, and technical exchange activity. The board found the administrative inquiry procedurally incomplete, specifically that the documented conduct concerns did not meet the threshold for restricted status under the bilateral agreement's Joint Personnel Protocol, and that the Provision 7 review had therefore been appropriately invoked. The inquiry was closed. Suvith Dahl was in the room for the closing determination. I was not. The board process did not require my presence. I heard the result from Price at 1740, in the maintenance corridor adjacent to the 3rd lower deck, with the atmospheric processors running their familiar background hum. He told me the board's finding. He told me the inquiry was closed. He told me that the human flag officer was filing a supplemental report through the Bilateral Affairs channel, noting certain concerns about the procedural conduct of station administrative processes during the preceding period. A report that would be in the Compact system and would follow Suvith Dahl's record for however long it needed to. Price looked at me for a long moment. The maintenance inspection on the 2C junction, he said. You submitted the authorization request on day 21. That's in the record, I said. Yes, he said, it is. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then he looked like he had decided not to. Is the sensor node actually getting replaced? He said finally. I've been told within the current maintenance cycle, I said, which ends in approximately 3 weeks. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. I'd hate for it to remain a gap. There is an analyst on Orth Station. His name is Seth Vareth, and he works in the Varunei Administrative Support Division, which is the category of station personnel that does the work of keeping the record, keeping accurate and current. He is not in Suvith Dahl's network. He is not in anyone's network that I was able to determine. He has been on station for 6 years, which is longer than anyone else currently assigned. And he has the quality that you sometimes find in long-tenure station personnel of having made a kind of peace with the place, of being more attached to the institution of the station than to any of the political currents running through it. 3 days after the board's determination, I encountered him in the Spoke 3 observation blister. This surprised me. I had never seen anyone else use it. He was standing at the viewport, looking at the Terminator line, and he did not look surprised to see me, which meant he had probably seen me come up here before and had chosen to come on a day when I was likely to be present. He was quiet for a while. We both watched the amber line. The day side of the world below was at this hour beginning its slow 14-hour cycle toward the Terminator, the leading edge of the scorched zone catching the station's shadow briefly before passing through. You have been on the observation deck before, he said. His standard was formal and slightly archaic, the register of someone who learned the language from text rather than from people. A few times, I said. It is useful for thinking, he said. Yes, I said. Another silence. The Terminator line moved its slow way across the world below us. I have administered personnel records for this station for 6 years, he said. I have seen 9 administrative inquiries in that time. 3 proceeded to external reporting. 6 were resolved at the board level. He paused. Of the 6 that resolved at board level, 5 of them involved conduct concerns that were ambiguous or unsupported. 1 involved conduct that was fully documented and procedurally correct in every respect, and the inquiry was still initiated. I said nothing. In that case, he said, the inquiry was held by a provision of the bilateral agreement that I confess I had not recalled was in the document. It is in Appendix C of the Personnel Protocol. Most personnel on this station have never read Appendix C. He looked at the world below. I suspect most personnel on this station have not read the full Personnel Protocol at all. It's a long document, I said. It is, he said. 342 pages. Appendix C is on page 209. He was quiet for a moment. The maintenance survey authorization for the 2C junction sensor node was submitted on day 21 of your assignment. The inquiry was not initiated until day 23. That's what the records show, I said. He turned to look at me then. His eyes were amber gold, deep orbital structure, the kind that in his species indicates high caste, but there was nothing of the political officer, just deliberate not looking in him. He just looked directly, the way a person looks when they are seeing clearly. I have been told, he said, that the humans of the contested Reach assignment pool are selected from specialists with Reach integration ratings and relevant prior deployments. Is Vale Prime a common deployment for Reach integration personnel? Not common, I said. He looked at me a moment longer. Then he turned back to the viewport. His subdermal bioluminescence ran a slow pattern under his skin that I had learned, over weeks of observation, to read as something between contemplation and settling, the way a very old tree might settle when the wind passes. I see, he said. I hope you find the observation deck useful during your continued assignment. I expect I will, I said. We stood there for a while longer, the two of us, watching the amber line at the edge of the world. He left first. I stayed. Suvith Dal was reassigned from Orith Station 47 days after the board's determination. The reassignment was notated in the personnel records as a routine bilateral rotation. The compact rotates its political officers on 18-month cycles, and Dahl had reached his rotation point. It was procedurally ordinary. It was the kind of thing that happens on joint stations all the time, without comment or ceremony, and it happened without comment or ceremony. I was in the maintenance corridor adjacent to the 3rd lower deck, running a scheduled calibration check on the atmospheric processor monitoring suite when the notification came through the joint station log. I read it, noted it, and finished the calibration check. The reading on sensor 4 was slightly high, within tolerance but worth flagging, and I filed a maintenance note for the engineering staff. It was not a triumphant day. I want to be clear about that. I am not telling you this story because it is a story about triumph. It is a story about geometry, about the specific patient, unremarkable work of understanding a space so completely that the space cannot be used against you without you already knowing where every wall is, where every door is, where every gap in the system is, long before the person trying to use that space against you has decided to move. Vale Prime teaches you that the environment that kills people is not the one that announces itself. It's the one that looks like a maintenance corridor. It's the one that looks like a routine briefing. It's the one that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening, because everything that is going to happen has already been arranged. Patiently, without drama, in the weeks before anyone visible does anything at all. Suvith Dal was good. He had built something real and solid over 4 months. He had used legitimate mechanisms, and he had been careful, and he had not made the mistakes that careless people make. He moved at the right time, in the right way, and from where he was standing, Everything was in order. What he had not accounted for was the possibility that I had been reading the room since the moment I walked through the processing terminal and saw a man studying his tablet with the particular concentration of someone who has decided not to watch the door. He built the trap for a person who did not know she was being watched. By the time he triggered it, the person inside the trap was already standing outside it, in a position he had not mapped, holding a piece of paper he had not known existed, prepared for a follow-up she had anticipated 3 days in advance. I did not tell him this. I did not tell anyone this, except in the way I am telling you now, looking back at it from a sufficient distance to see the shape of the whole thing clearly. Major Price requested I be retained at Orith Station for a second rotation. The request was approved. I am writing this at the start of that second rotation, from the observation blister above Spoke 3, with a cup of Nesh water, which I have decided I genuinely prefer to the synthetic coffee the contingent stores carry, though I would not say so in mixed company. The Terminator line is amber today. The day side is coming around. Below me, the Class 16 world turns its slow, patient turn, the scorched half and the frozen half. And between them, that seam where something like life is possible if you know how to read the terrain. The sensor node in the 2C junction was replaced 12 days ago. The corridor is monitored now. I have found 3 other gaps in the system. I have not filed maintenance requests for them yet. I filed notes in the maintenance system, time-stamped routine, noting their status. When I need the authorizations, they will be there, already dated, already in the record. You learn, on a world that is trying to kill you, that the most dangerous moment is not the one where the threat is visible. The most dangerous moment is the one right before it becomes visible. The moment where everything looks ordinary, and nothing has broken yet, and the threat is still deciding whether you are the kind of thing it should worry about. That is the moment where the work happens. Not the response, not the finish. The quiet, unremarkable daily work of knowing the room so completely that when the moment arrives, you already know exactly where you're going to be. The rest is just being there.